Tallahassee, Florida, February 4th, 1987. At first, it looked like something of a misunderstanding. Two well-dressed men stood in a public park with 6 children. The kids looked dirty, hungry, and strangely silent. The men claimed that they were on their way to Mexico to start a school for exceptional children. But to the residents of Myers Park, something felt off. The kids weren't playing, they weren't talking, they were just watching. So someone called the police. When the officers arrived, they immediately noticed that the children were in poor condition. They were covered in bug bites, wearing old, mismatched clothes, and showing signs of malnutrition and neglect. The 2 men, identified as Douglas Ammerman and Michael Houlihan, said that they were teachers, but they had no identification on them. The officers pressed further. Where were the children's birth certificates? Who were their legal guardians? The men couldn't or wouldn't answer. That's when the police made the decision that would unravel one of the most disturbing government entanglements in U.S. history. They took everyone in for questioning. As authorities began digging, the story got stranger and fast. The 2 men were placed under arrest for child abuse and suspicion of trafficking. The children were separated for interviews. According to police reports, one child, described as around 6 years old, didn't know what a toilet was. Another asked if they were going to be put in jail like before. Some of the children said they lived in a communal house in Washington, D.C., where women were not allowed to bathe the boys, and where punishment meant silence, deprivation, and something more. The children weren't able to articulate exactly what that meant. All 6 children appeared to be suffering from psychological trauma, yet none were listed as missing in any national database. While the kids were interviewed in Florida, police in Washington, D.C. moved in on the group's known residence. What they found would shock even seasoned officers. The home, a 2-story townhouse located at 39 West Street, didn't look unusual from the outside. In fact, it blended into the neighborhood so well that many residents didn't even know it was shared by this group calling themselves the Finders. Inside, the house was cluttered with surveillance equipment, piles of computer disks, maps, journals. In one room, officers discovered a telex machine, basically a relic of early digital communication. It was hooked up to foreign embassies. In another room, they found photographs, children tied up in strange positions that looked ritualistic. Even many photos were labeled and cataloged as if part of a data archive. Police also recovered detailed files on child acquisition tactics, child care instructions written in code, and passports linked to destinations all over the world, including North Korea, Malaysia, and Moscow. Even more disturbing, the home contained a large hand-drawn map of underground tunnels, specifically in Washington, D.C., labeled with words like exit points, observation, and containment. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Tonight we dive into a mysterious group called the Finders. A word of caution: this story isn't for the faint of heart and bears shocking similarities to the Jeffrey Epstein case. The similarities are so incredible, I'll just let you judge for yourselves. Back in Tallahassee, the FBI had now gotten involved, but instead of helping expand the investigation, they did something else. They took over. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived, seized all files and evidence from the local Tallahassee police, and ordered a full media blackout on the case. Much to the frustration of local law enforcement, they were told to stand down. Suddenly, instead of being a clear-cut case of potential trafficking, the Finders case became classified as a national security matter. Why? What's in those files? Who were the Finders? Why did the US government go to such great lengths to silence the story? Over the next few months, charges against Ammerman and Houlihan would be quietly dropped. The children were released into the custody of relatives. No public information exists to confirm who those people were. The DC house was sold, the group dissolved from public view, and the files locked away in the FBI's archives for decades until someone forced them open. The Finders weren't the last group to be protected from prosecution, but they were one of the first that begged the questions. What's our government really willing to cover up when it involves children, and why? From the outside, the Finders were just another eccentric group in Washington, D.C.'s patchwork of alternative thinkers. A commune, perhaps intellectuals, maybe weird but harmless. At least that's what they wanted us to believe. In fact, the group operated out of at least two main properties: a townhouse at 3918 West Street in Georgetown and a farm in rural Culpeper, Virginia, which members referred to as their retreat center. The public-facing group was rather simple. The finders were a loosely organized group of adults exploring alternative living arrangements, education systems, even societal structures. They homeschooled their children, they lived communally, and supposedly rejected mainstream ideology. But underneath that bohemian veneer, something nefarious was brewing. At the center of it all was a man named Marion Pettie, born 1920. To the FBI and others who later investigated him, Pettie was a deep enigma. He wasn't just some crank philosopher running a commune. According to official records and multiple interviews, Pettie had military ties, including service as a chauffeur at military intelligence schools. He bragged about knowing people in the CIA, the NSA, and the DIA. He was known to rent rooms to intelligence operatives, both foreign and domestic. Even his wife, Isabel Pettie, had worked for Army intelligence and then later the CIA, according to several sources. But guess what Pettie's official job title was for most of his life? He called himself a gamesman. His personal philosophy: nothing is true, everything is permitted. Now, according to some former members, Pettie believed the world was a grand simulation, that societal norms were traps. He believed children could be raised without traditional morality, free from guilt, shame, or even laws. Some members took this to terrifying extremes. During the 1987 raid of the finders' Georgetown townhouse, police discovered a bizarre fusion of early computer technology, occult symbolism, and intelligence-level communications. Among the most alarming discoveries were a full computer network advanced for its time, with encrypted files on child acquisition, imprinting exercises, and coded messages. Investigators found dozens of photographs, many showing children naked, some bound, some in painful positions. There was evidence of global travel, passports, visa stamps, foreign currency, and coded telex messages sent to contacts in China, North Korea, the USSR, and Malaysia. Additionally, detailed files on child behavior, including reward conditioning, obedience programming, and sensory isolation. One officer involved in the search described it as a cross between a CIA black site and a Ring's headquarters. Even more disturbing, police found instructions for obtaining children, how to lure them, how to transport them without detection, and how to break their will over time. Roughly 60 miles outside of DC in rural Virginia, the finders operated a 200-acre compound they called their retreat. But this wasn't a wellness center. Witnesses described underground bunkers and tunnel system, no electricity or phones, but a powerful shortwave radio array. Children were running in the fields naked, unsupervised, or being led in strange rituals. Former members and journalists who visited the property noted that children were taught to be completely autonomous from an early age, but they were also subjected to extreme discipline. There was no formal schooling, no connection to the outside world, and no legal records. What made the finders so confusing to investigators was that their ideology was not overly religious or political. They were not Satanists, Christians, Marxists, or even cultish in the traditional sense. Their belief system was based on manipulation, control, and surveillance. They taught that society was an illusion, that family ties were a construct, that children should be raised to obey the collective, not their biological parents, and perhaps most importantly, they believed that constant surveillance was important. The group kept detailed activity and coded files on member movements and contacts. To law enforcement, it looked disturbingly like a domestic intelligence operation, not unlike training schools for spies or handlers. So let's recap. A DC-based group led by a man with intelligence ties, running encrypted communications across global lines, while transporting undocumented children across state borders, with files on how to condition them, and photographs that would later be described by investigators as clear signs of sexual exploitation. And yet no one was ever charged. Why? I suppose that's the burning question, and not surprisingly, leads directly into the next chapter of this story, the cover-up. As local police in both Florida and Washington, D.C. began to piece together the scope of what they've uncovered, like international contacts, child abuse files, photos, maps, codes, something changed. The case was about to reach headlines, but it never would, because just days after the children were taken into custody and the DC townhouse was raided, the FBI stepped in, not as allies, but as erasers. According to retired customs agent Ramon Martinez, who assisted in the initial investigation and personally visited the finder's DC townhouse, the FBI arrived unannounced and within hours began seizing everything. Martinez wrote in an official memorandum, "All evidence was removed. I was told the case had become a CIA internal matter and that further police involvement was no longer necessary." That's unprecedented. The photos, the floppy disks, the coded files, the logs of communication with embassies, all taken. Gone. Even Tallahassee police, the ones who had made the original arrest, they were told to cease all further inquiries. By the end of February 1987, within just 3 weeks of the original arrest, all criminal charges against Ammerman and Houlihan were quietly dropped. The children, still bearing signs of abuse and neglect, were turned over to unidentified individuals presumed to be guardians or relatives. No names were ever made public, no court transcripts were ever released, and no efforts were made to verify the origin or background of the children. Even more disturbing, the media, which had initially picked up the story, suddenly went silent. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Associated Press all ran short stories in early February. But after that, nothing. Not one follow-up. No pressure from the public, no televised outrage. It was as if it never happened. Go figure. So, what was the FBI protecting? In 1993, a breakthrough occurred, quietly and largely unnoticed by the public, I might add. Documents released through FOIA requests revealed that the CIA had admitted to involvement with the finders. Specifically, the agency's Office of Security stated that some members of the finders had been used in past overseas operations. Let that sink in for a moment. A group accused of child abuse, trafficking, and psychological manipulation had previously worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. Was this some rogue cult that the agency happened to stumble across, or was it something else? Ramon Martinez wasn't the only insider to raise alarms. In 1993, the Department of Justice reopened the case following public concern raised by a segment aired on the TV show America's Most Wanted. A DOJ report was compiled and heavily redacted. It concluded that while there were numerous indicators of criminal behavior, insufficient evidence remained due to conflicting jurisdiction, loss of the materials, and destruction of certain records. In other words, the evidence had been erased, and without it, the finders were once again cleared of wrongdoing. This is not the first time intelligence agencies have been connected to controversial experiments and human rights violations. Remember, MKUltra was real, a decades-long CIA project involving drugs, hypnosis, and trauma-based mind control. Operation Chaos, that's the domestic spying operation targeting American dissidents. How about Operation Mockingbird, where government attempted to control media narratives through embedded CIA assets in major newsrooms? This happened. So when law enforcement officers allege that a group trafficking children was tied to US intelligence, maybe it's not paranoia. Maybe it's precedent. We don't know what exactly the finders were, but we do know what they weren't. They weren't just a commune. They weren't just weird intellectuals, and they weren't harmless. They were protected by someone, and they were erased by design. Case closed due to lack of evidence. February 1987, the initial arrests of 2 men traveling with 6 underage children across state lines sparked local headlines. The Tallahassee Democrat, Washington Post, and the UPI all ran brief, cautiously worded articles. Headlines like 2 men held on child abuse charges, children said to be ill-clothed, hungry, suspected cult linked to DC townhouse. Within days, the details grew more disturbing. Reports surfaced about photographs, encrypted messages, and foreign ties. Police gave interviews. Federal agents took over, and then nada. By mid-February, not a single major newspaper followed up on the story. No investigative reports, no press conferences, no Sunday specials. Local reporters in Tallahassee who had pushed for answers said that they were met with stonewalling from law enforcement. One journalist claimed that sources suddenly stopped returning calls. Another said that their newsroom was visited by someone in a suit who advised them to drop the story. Television stations that had initially covered the story, including CBS affiliates in both Florida and Washington, scrubbed references within a week. The narrative collapsed like a stage prop, leaving behind only rumors and fragments. There's something profoundly strange about a story like this involving child endangerment, international travel, and possible intelligence links. All this being buried in an era when media was hungry for sensationalism. This wasn't the internet age. There were only a handful of networks, and their influence was immense. So why wasn't the story pursued? Even in the 1990s, when FOIA documents began trickling out, revealing redacted memos, suspicious internal notes, and even partial CIA acknowledgement of involvement, not a single major outlet covered it. The New York Times never ran a follow-up. CNN remained silent. Even shows like 60 Minutes, known for explosive investigative work, stayed quiet. Legacy media was ducking for cover. This is what researchers now call memory holing. It's a term borrowed from George Orwell's 1984. It refers to the quiet removal of inconvenient truths from public discourse. In this case, it happened through a combination of media self-censorship, federal suppression of evidence, public confusion from conflicting reports, and ultimately time. By the early 2000s, the finders had become a digital ghost story whispered about in internet forums, among the UFO crowd, and through government conspiracy researchers. Even though the FBI files were made publicly available in 2019 through a massive online archive dump, public didn't react. No major headlines, no trending hashtags, no Netflix documentaries, nothing. Why is this? Seriously, can anyone tell me why? Probably because the world had already forgotten. There's a deeper problem at work here, one that plays into why these stories are so easily buried. The mind resists believing that something this horrific, this organized, could be real. A cult that traffics children, possibly with government support, operating out of Georgetown, using computers, psychological techniques, and coded communications. Sounds like fiction, right? Like something out of the X-Files? So even when real documents show that children were involved, evidence existed, no prosecutions happened, it doesn't compute. It's easy to forget. But what if the finders weren't an isolated case? What if they were just one publicly exposed node in a much larger, more deeply embedded network? A blueprint for how modern trafficking rings operate, for how media is neutralized, for how the public attention is redirected. Because remember, this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in Washington, D.C., the most heavily surveilled and politically protected city in America. The Finders case is not just a disturbing scandal, it's a template for how power buries truth. First, confuse the story, then erase the evidence. Finally, let time do the rest. By the time the truth surfaces, no one's looking. A perfect, terrible plan. 2 men arrested, possible cult activity. Authorities say no further action. After that, silence. Then, one last voice, a young reporter in 1993. The Finders? I don't think anyone covers that anymore. 30 years after the Finders case was buried, the same questions are being asked again. This time, the name is different. Not Marion Pettie, but Jeffrey Epstein. Not a commune in Georgetown, but a private island. A jet, a black book full of names. And yet the pattern is familiar. Disturbingly familiar, right? I mean, why isn't anyone talking about this? Let's compare. In 1987, 2 men were caught transporting 6 children in Florida under suspicious circumstances. Authorities investigated and found clear signs of abuse, coded documents, and evidence of international trafficking. By 1988, charges were dropped, the evidence was seized, and the case was labeled no longer a law enforcement matter. So, no one went to jail. No one was held accountable, and the story just disappeared. Now, in 2005, Jeffrey Epstein was accused of abusing underage girls in Palm Beach, Florida. Over 30 victims came forward. By 2008, Epstein received a secret plea deal brokered by U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. He served 13 months, not in prison, but in a private wing with work release privileges. Federal agents built a case, dozens of girls gave testimony, and yet no one else was prosecuted. The client list never released, the media silent, at least until a decade later. Like the Finders, the Epstein case is riddled with redactions, court records were sealed, warrants were delayed, witness lists were never disclosed, and perhaps most critically, the Epstein list remains hidden. We know that Epstein's plane, nicknamed the Lolita Express, ferried elite passengers to and from his private island where, according to victims, and blackmail were routine. Yet, despite years of pressure, not one high-profile name has ever been indicted. Go figure. There's a strategy to how these stories are presented to the public. With the Finders, the group was labeled as eccentric, fringe, or simply weird. Not dangerous, not organized, certainly not part of a larger structure. With Epstein, the media initially portrayed him as a creepy rich guy, a pervert, an isolated predator, not a man at the center of a global trafficking network protected by intelligence agencies and billionaires. This kind of media framing does two things. It isolates the threat so that we stop asking who else is involved, and it shuts down accountability because the monster has already been removed. But what if that monster was just a middleman? In the Finders case, the CIA explicitly admitted that members were tied to past operations. That admission was buried in a 1993 report, never picked up by a single major outlet. In the Epstein case, former Israeli intelligence officials, ex-Mossad agents, and even CIA-affiliated names have floated through the background. Even Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was himself suspected of being a Mossad double agent with deep ties to both Western and Middle Eastern intelligence networks. Multiple victims claim that cameras were everywhere in Epstein's homes, not just for voyeurism, but for blackmail. So ask yourself, was Epstein gathering intelligence, or was he part of a larger program? This isn't just coincidence, it's a method, a system. Despite a Netflix series, despite viral outrage, despite mountains of evidence, no names, no prosecutions, no change. Just like with the Finders, the Epstein case is drifting into public amnesia, and yet survivors continue to speak. Documents remain sealed, and the public, once again, being told to move on. The Finders taught us how stories like this can vanish. Epstein showed us how they repeat. And if we're not paying attention, it will happen again. Because when power and perversion intersect behind closed doors, justice doesn't arrive, it disappears. Two stories, two different decades, two rings of influence, secrecy, and pain, and yet the same outcome. In 1987, the world had never heard of the Finders. By 1988, they were ghosts, names sealed in files, children unaccounted for, and journalists warned to look the other way. In 2005, the name Jeffrey Epstein emerged from the shadows. By 2020, he was dead in a jail cell, and then the names he carried with him vanished into silence. These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern. A methodical blueprint for how power conceals its worst secrets. First, compartmentalize the operation. Limit the number of people who see the full picture. Outsource the worst work to intermediaries. Create layers of plausible deniability. Next, control the media narrative. Label the perpetrators as eccentric, controversial, or troubled. Isolate the incident. Never show the connections. Then, neutralize the investigators. Reassign them, discredit them, overrule them, and when necessary, erase the records entirely. Be sure to delay until memory fades. Let time do what suppression can't. Shift public attention. Wait for the outrage to pass. After that, bury the evidence, literally, physically. Seal documents, redactions, classified files, and when all that's gone, rewrite the story. If no one remembers what happened, we're faced with that existential question: did it ever really happen? Some will say that the Finders were just weirdos, Epstein was just a pervert. It's all in the past. But is it? If networks like these could operate in plain sight, if intelligence agencies could intervene in criminal investigations, if public outrage can be diffused with silence and distraction, and this isn't just about what happened, It's about what's still happening. Somewhere right now, a system like this could be running again. Newer, smarter, better hidden. Because the only lesson learned from the finders and Epstein is that they got away with it. Today, people are asking louder than ever. Where's the Epstein client list? Why has no one been prosecuted? Why are judges sealing records? Why do survivors keep getting ignored? And when you ask these questions, they call you a conspiracy theorist. But what else can we do when conspiracies are protected by institutions? This isn't fringe. It's history. It's our history. And it's still unfolding. The Finders case isn't ancient news. It's not folklore. It's a warning. A glimpse into how the powerful erase their crimes. It's a template for modern cover-ups. It's a reminder that if we don't look back, if we don't hold the past to the light, we're doomed to live through it again. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.